Picture this. It's August 8th, 1988. 91-year-old Harry Grossman, a Cubs fan since 1906, stands at a microphone at Wrigley Field. He counts down, 1, 2, 3, then bellows into the night, "Let there be light." Suddenly, 632 blazing lights illuminate the friendly confines for the first time in its 74-year history. The crowd of 39,008 erupts. This is it. The Cubs are finally joining the modern era of baseball. But then, just 4 innings later, something biblical happens. A thunderstorm of epic proportions rolls in, washing out the game and sending it to the history books as nothing. The game never counted. You couldn't write this stuff. But this isn't just a story about lights or rain delays. This is the story of one of the most brutal political battles in Chicago history, a 7-year war involving newspaper vendettas, backroom deals, organized protests, and political dynasties that would make Game of Thrones look like a children's show. Welcome to the shocking true story of how the Cubs became the last team in Major League Baseball to install lights, and the incredible fight it took to get there. The holdout. The last bastion of day baseball. By 1988, the Chicago Cubs were living fossils. While the rest of baseball had embraced night games since 1935, when President Franklin Roosevelt literally flipped a switch from the White House to illuminate Cincinnati's Wrigley Field, Wrigley Field remained stubbornly, almost defiantly a daytime-only ballpark. Think about that for a moment. For 53 years, every other major league team had installed lights. By 1948, the Detroit Tigers were the last holdout until they caved. That left the Chicago Cubs alone, playing all 81 home games during the day, like some quaint museum exhibit of baseball's past. The numbers tell the story of this stubborn resistance. 5,687 consecutive day games. That's not a typo, 5,687 straight day games at Wrigley Field. The man who said no. The architect of this resistance was Philip K. Wrigley, heir to the chewing gum fortune and Cubs owner from 1932 to 1977. Wrigley wasn't just opposed to night baseball, he was philosophically against it. As court records would later reveal, he believed that baseball is a daytime sport and that lights would have a deteriorating effect upon the surrounding neighborhood. But here's where it gets interesting. Wrigley wasn't always anti-lights. In 1942, he actually ordered a complete lighting system for Wrigley Field. The Chicago Tribune reported that 165 tons of steel, 35,000 feet of copper wire, and 800 aluminum reflectors were ready to be installed. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The very next day, Wrigley donated all that steel to the war effort. It was a patriotic gesture that would haunt Cubs fans for decades. The White Sox conspiracy that never was. By 1942, desperation was setting in. The Cubs were seriously considering renting Comiskey Park from their crosstown rivals, the White Sox, for night games. Imagine Cubs fans having to watch their team play home games on the South Side. But when the Cubs approached the White Sox, they were met with a firm no. The Sox issued a joint statement saying they wanted to retain the north-south boundary between the teams. Translation? Not a chance in hell. One can only imagine the smugness on the South Side. The White Sox had installed lights in 1939, and here were the rivals, hand in hand, begging to use their ballpark. The curse of day baseball. This stubborn adherence to day baseball may have actually cursed the Cubs. Think about it. In 38 seasons, from 1946 to 1983, the Cubs had just 3 second-place finishes and 5 third-place finishes. The rest, mediocrity and misery. The schedule worked against them in every way imaginable. Day games meant smaller crowds, most people were working, it meant less television revenue, and it meant that when they did finally get good, they faced a devastating ultimatum that would rock Chicago to its core. The trigger event. The 1984 Cubs, so close, yet so far. In 1984, something magical happened. Under new general manager Dallas Green, a man described by Cubs PR director Bob Ibach as having the presence of John Wayne, that shock of white hair, and he was a gunslinger, the Cubs suddenly became good, really good. They won 96 games in the National League East. Ryne Sandberg had his MVP season. The team was electric, and Cubs fans dared to dream of the first World Series since 1945. But there was a problem, a big problem. Major League Baseball had signed a $1.2 billion television contract that required postseason games to be played at night for maximum viewership. The Cubs, with their quaint little ballpark without lights, were about to learn what that meant. the ultimate humiliation. In late 1984, MLB delivered an ultimatum that would make Cubs fans' blood boil. If the Cubs made the World Series, they would have to play their home games somewhere else. The league had identified two potential sites: Milwaukee County Stadium and Busch Stadium in St. Louis. Let that sink in. The Cubs, if they reached the World Series, would have to play their home games 300 miles away. Bob Ibach, the Cubs PR director at the time, revealed years later, "The one place I know we were never going to go would be over to the White Sox ballpark because the Cubs fans would have killed us." The Cubs didn't make the World Series in 1984. They collapsed in the playoffs against San Diego, but the message was clear: get lights or get out. The Tribune Company takes over. In 1981, the Wrigley family had sold the Cubs to the Tribune Company, the media giant that owned the Chicago Tribune newspaper. Unlike the Wrigleys, the Tribune Company was in the business of making money, not preserving tradition. The new owners immediately began pushing for lights. They hired Dallas Green. They started making noise about night baseball, and they began what would become a 7-year political war that would tear Chicago apart. The war begins. Cubs versus the Cubs. But the Tribune Company underestimated their opposition. Almost immediately, a grassroots organization formed called the Cubs, Citizens United for Baseball and Sunshine. The acronym was brilliant, and their yellow t-shirts with "No Lights in Wrigley Field" became ubiquitous in Wrigleyville. Charlotte Neufeld, the chairwoman of Cubs, became the face of the resistance. Her argument was simple but powerful. They can play nightball, but not in our neighborhood. The neighbors had legitimate concerns. Wrigley Field was surrounded by residential housing. Unlike most ballparks, it was literally in the middle of a neighborhood. Residents were already dealing with traffic, noise, and parking problems from 81 day games. The thought of drunk, rowdy fans stumbling through the streets at 11 p.m. was terrifying. Cubs organized protests, attended every single council meeting, and even showed up at a Cubs game wearing their protest t-shirts. They were organized, passionate, and politically savvy. The political power play. But this is Chicago, so of course it gets political. And when it gets political in Chicago, it gets dirty. Enter Edward Fast Eddie Vrdolyak, one of the most powerful and controversial politicians in Chicago history. Vrdolyak was the alderman from the 10th Ward, city council president, and chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party. He was known for his bare-knuckled political style and his ability to make or break deals in the back rooms of City Hall. In 1983, Vrdolyak pushed through a city ordinance that effectively banned night games at Wrigley Field. The vote was 42-2. It wasn't even close. But here's the shocking part. Vrdolyak didn't give a damn about baseball or neighborhood concerns. According to multiple sources, including a blistering 1985 Tribune editorial, Vrdolyak had one motivation. He wanted the Tribune Company to stop publishing editorial criticism of him. This was political extortion, pure and simple. Vrdolyak was essentially saying, "Stop criticizing me in your newspaper, or your baseball team will never play night games." The Springfield connection. When the Tribune Company tried to get the Illinois state legislature to override Chicago's ordinance, they ran into another political buzzsaw. Illinois House Speaker Mike Madigan, who would later become one of the most powerful politicians in Illinois history, was Vrdolyak's ally. Together, they formed an almost impenetrable wall against the Cubs' lighting plans. The Tribune's 1985 editorial spelled it out. Mr. Madigan made sure the Cubs weren't successful in getting the state legislature to override the city ordinance. Mr. Madigan and his law firm represented a lot of people who end up doing business with state government. You come by him, or you don't get by. The editorial concluded with a devastating assessment. To handle Mr. Madigan, you have to make some kind of deal. Take him some incense, myrrh, maybe some silk from the east, and kneel when you go before his throne. The breaking point. The threat that changed everything. By 1985, the Cubs were getting desperate. Commissioner Pete Jeberoth issued a stark warning. If the city and state continued to block night games, Major League Baseball would have no alternative but to resolve the situation on its own, including prohibiting the Cubs from hosting any postseason games. But even worse, the Tribune Company began making noises about leaving Wrigley Field entirely. They owned 100 acres in suburban Schaumburg Township and started talking about building a new stadium there. For Cubs fans, this was an existential threat. Wrigley Field wasn't just a ballpark, it was a cathedral, a piece of Chicago's soul. The thought of the Cubs playing in some sterile suburban dome was horrifying. Harold Washington steps in. The political landscape began to shift in 1983 when Harold Washington became Chicago's first black mayor. Washington initially opposed lights at Wrigley, but as the pressure mounted and the threat of the Cubs leaving became real, he began to reconsider. In 1987, Washington endorsed a middle course plan that would allow 18 night games per season. It was a compromise that nobody loved but everyone could live with. The alliance crumbles. But then something unexpected happened. Fast Eddie Vrdolyak switched parties. In 1987, fed up with Harold Washington and the Democratic Party, Vrdolyak became a Republican. This was a game changer. Suddenly, Mike Madigan had no reason to protect his former ally. The political coalition that had kept the Cubs in the dark for 7 years was falling apart. Let there be light, the vote that changed history. On February 25th, 1988, 3 months after Harold Washington's sudden death and with Eugene Sawyer serving as acting mayor, the Chicago City Council voted 29-19 to allow the Cubs to install lights. The ordinance was a compromise. The Cubs could play 18 night games per season with strict start times and noise restrictions. It wasn't everything the Cubs wanted, but it was enough. Charlotte Neufeld and the Cubs protesters were there that night, watching their 7-year fight come to an end. Years later, Neufeld would claim a kind of victory. One of the reasons Wrigley Field has remained and is as popular as it is that we made it a worldwide icon based on sunshine and green. It was that campaign on no lights that did it. The $5 million light show. General Electric installed the $5 million lighting system in April 1988. 6 towers with 632 lights would forever change the character of the friendly confines. The Cubs announced 7 night games for the 1988 season, starting with August 8th against the Philadelphia Phillies. The curse strikes back. And then we come to that magical cursed night of August 8, 1988. 522 media representatives descended on Wrigley Field, more than covered Pete Rose's breaking tie Cubs hitting record. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra performed the national anthem. Hall of Famers Ernie Banks and Billy Williams threw out ceremonial first pitches. At 6:09 p.m., 91-year-old Harold Grossman, who had been attending Cubs games since 1906, flipped the switch. The crowd of 39,008 erupted as the lights blazed to life. Rick Sutcliffe threw the first pitch to Phil Bradley at 7:01 p.m. The temperature was 91 degrees and muggy, but on Sutcliffe's 4th pitch, Bradley launched a home run over the left center field wall, the first hit in Cubs night baseball history. The Cubs took a 3-1 lead into the 4th inning, and then the baseball gods laughed. A thunderstorm of biblical proportions rolled in, not a light drizzle, a statement storm with thunder, lightning, and torrential rain. Cubs players Jody Davis, Les Lancaster, Al Nipper, and Greg Maddux ran onto the field and slid across the wet tarp, earning laughs from teammates and $500 fines from manager Don Zimmer. After a 2-hour, 10-minute rain delay, the game was called. Since only 3.5 innings were completed, the game didn't count. It was wiped from the record books. As one fan said while running from the ballpark, this proves that the Cubs are cursed. The Tribune editorialized the next day, "Someone up there seems to take day baseball seriously." Charlotte Neufeld, president of Cubs, had been prophetic 2 weeks earlier when she said, "It may rain August 8th. The actual first official night game at Wrigley Field was August 9, 1988. The Cubs beat the New York Mets 6-4 in a rain-free contest before 36,399 fans. Mike Bielecki, not Rick Sutcliffe, threw the first official pitch under the lights. Lenny Dykstra of the Mets, not Phil Bradley of the Phillies, hit the first official home run. But for most Cubs fans, August 8th was the real first night game, rain or no rain. The transformation, the neighborhood that changed. All those fears about night games ruining Wrigleyville, they turned out to be spectacularly wrong. Instead of declining, property values skyrocketed. The neighborhood became one of the most desirable areas. Bars and restaurants thrived. Wrigleyville became a destination, not just a place where a ballpark happened to be located. As one reporter noted, "Anyone who still lives in the neighborhood has seen the value of the house go up 1,000,000-fold since the early 1980s, which is a fair trade-off for having a few people pee on your car." All right, the irony of history. Here's the ultimate irony. When the Cubs finally won the World Series in 2016, ending their 108-year drought, they did it at night under the lights in Cleveland. The franchise that had resisted night baseball for 53 years won their greatest victory in the darkness. Had they somehow made it to the World Series in 1984 or 1985, they would have been the first homeless home team in World Series history, forcing to play their home games 300 miles away. The legacy. Today, an entire generation of Cubs fans has grown up with the lights at Wrigley Field. Night games are limited to 18 per season by agreement with the city, making them special events rather than routine occurrences. The lights themselves have become part of Wrigley's charm. The 6 light towers, each 125 feet tall, are now as much part of the ballpark's character as the ivy-covered walls on the manual scoreboard. The politicians. Fast Eddie Vrdolyak's political career ended in failure. His 1989 mayoral campaign as a Republican was a disaster. He received less than 4% of the vote. He eventually faced multiple federal corruption charges and served prison time. Mike Madigan served as Illinois House Speaker for 36 years before finally stepping down amid corruption investigations. Ironically, in later years, he spent thousands of dollars on Cubs and White Sox tickets for his political allies. The lights at Wrigley Field represented more than just technological progress. They represented the collision between tradition and modernity, between neighborhood concerns and corporate interests, between the romance of baseball's past and the economic realities of its future. It took a newspaper vendetta, political corruption, organized protests, legal battles, and an act of God to finally bring lights to the friendly confines. In the end, it wasn't progress that won, it was the breakdown of a political alliance built on spite and extortion. On August 8, 1988, when 91-year-old Harold Grossman flipped the switch and declared, "Let there be light," he wasn't just illuminating a ballpark, he was ending one of the most bizarre and brutal political battles in Chicago history. And maybe, just maybe, the rain that washed out that first game was the baseball god's way of saying, you may have lights now, but you're still the Cubs. Some things never change.